Pope Francis visited Hungary last week. How was that visit received? And what can we learn about the importance of Catholic values from a family that influenced European history for 800 years? Joining me to discuss is Hungarian Ambassador to the Holy See and author of the new book, The Habsburg Way, 7 Rules for Turbulent Times. Would you welcome Eduard Habsburg? Thank you for being here. Before we get to the book, I want to begin with your resume, which I couldn't believe when I read it. You have been a zombie movie screenwriter, a novelist, a cartoon producer. This is not the resume of most ambassadors to the Holy See. How is it that you came to be Hungary's ambassador at the Vatican?
Funny you should say that. That was the thing I told the Hungarian government when they asked me whether I wanted to be their ambassador to the Holy See. I said, guys, I wrote a zombie movie. I'm not your diplomat type. But they convinced me to try it, and I arrived and I hit the floor running and learned. And it's been the greatest ride of my life. The last 8 years around the Holy See has been really, I did many different jobs before, as you said just now. But in this job, I can really bring in all of my personality, my interests, and I love it. I love it very much.
Pope Francis was in Hungary this last week. I know you were there as well. It was among the most beautiful visits of his papacy, I have to say. And I was struck by the clarity of so many of the messages he offered there. How was it received by the people of Hungary, 60% of whom are Catholic? The Pope seemed like a different man in Hungary.
I think he has been nurturing a great love for Hungary since decades, and I've seen little signs of that over the last 8 years. He told me personally that what impression he had of Hungary, but when he arrived, he really began covering us with gifts. The Hungarians felt the love of a pastor for his people. He engaged with them. He took one bath in the crowd that was absolutely not planned after he was in St. Stephen's Cathedral in the center of Budapest. And there weren't even any measures to keep the people back. And he just took a huge bath in the crowd. He spoke to 10,000s of young people in the stadium, spoke to them about prayer, about confession, about God's forgiveness. He spoke to us politicians and, us politicians and diplomats, representatives of the state. And you could tell that he felt at home in Hungary, because what most media nowadays probably can't even believe is the Pope and Hungary are very, very close in their positions on far more topics than you would think.
Yeah. What was the overarching message that you think the people of Hungary took from the visit?
I think he thanked us for standing up for family, for values, for tradition, for Christians all over the world. And they really felt our Pope loves us. And I think that love went back to him. He felt so much at ease. There is one snapshot of him with our president, Katalin Novak, her with beautiful blue eyes. And they both laugh from all their hearts together. This was the atmosphere. The Pope was with his faithful, and the faithful had their pastor visiting. It was not a political visit. It was a deeply pastoral visit.
Now, Eduard, if you believe the secular coverage, the headlines were covered with the Pope challenging Prime Minister Orban over immigration. But tell us, is that how you interpreted this idea that you have to open the doors, and reconcile that with the reality of the way Hungary has welcomed Ukrainian refugees into your country?
In fact, you're absolutely right, Raymond. I was sitting in the room when the Pope gave that speech. It was a long speech. It was a beautiful speech, I have to say. I was moved to tears once or twice during his speech. And he thanked us for what we did for the Ukrainian refugees. And he praised the Hungarian government for many things, very outspoken. He made a very strong statement on gender ideology and the dangers of it. You won't find any trace of that in any article in any of the mainstream media, of course. They picked out that one half line from the end of his speech where he said that one should be more welcoming. And he did something very clever. He quoted our King Stephen to us, who spoke about welcoming strangers. That was very wise and clever of him. But like a good father, he will encourage you where you can do a bit more. And we took it in that spirit. And I tell you, at the end of the speech, the entire Hungarian political leadership, Orbán, Katalin Novak, and all the ministers jumped up, and we gave minutes of standing ovation for this speech. So I don't think that the Pope criticized us very harshly.
Yeah. What was it like growing up as a Habsburg? I mean, with this family lineage that really spans much of European history, goes back 800 years.
Well, the first time you realize you're different from other people is in school, when the teacher in history class, because you know the Habsburgs have interacted with European history for, as you said, 800 years, when the teacher looks at you in front of all the other kids and says, "But this is surely something Mr. Habsburg can tell us more about," and you of course don't know, and you blush furiously, and then you decide when you go home, I need to know something because this might happen next week again. So you begin to ask your parents, and then you grow into this identity, because it's really like having a little spotlight flying above you. People will notice more what you do, and people seem to expect something of you. They expect a Habsburg to be in a certain way. So the book I wrote was also an answer to this. For what do the Habsburgs stand, and what are those principles we should live according to?
Yeah, and the book is called The Habsburg Way. It's 7 rules for turbulent times. Now, what is this Habsburg Way, and why are your family's values so fitting and important today?
Well, that was the great discovery I made when I sat down to collect the central principles of our family. I realized most of these are gone. I don't see them in everyday life. I don't see them in politics, most of all. And then I said, wow, perhaps there is a real message for people in our world, something that they can take home. And so if you think about the Habsburgs, usually the first 2 associations that people have is Catholic and family, because the Habsburgs were not famous for conquests and massacres and gigantic wars, but they mostly made alliances by marrying off their children and making friendship between people by marriage. It's a positive thing. They all have lots of kids, and all of these kids were Catholic. So I would say the message here is have a family. My first rule is basically get married and have lots of kids. I have 6. That's not lots. When I arrived here in the States for my tour, at the first dinner, I met with 3 families who had more than 8 kids and who looked a bit down on my 6. So lots of kids. And
well, this is you're right. Your first rule here is, get married and have a lot of children. This is not a popular principle or even an operable principle in the West today. Why is getting married, do you think, and having children so important, and why do you think it's fallen out of favor?
I think it's the greatest decision you can make. I think it's the greatest gift you can make each other as spouses, to have lots of kids, and the greatest gift you can make to the children, to have lots of siblings. But it also makes sense for a state to encourage this. Hungary, for instance, has a whole series of measures to encourage families to have more children, because a state with numerous families is a state that will be built upon compassion, upon love for the neighbor, and not upon egotism. We live in a time where mainstream media, where technocracy, where all these people try to push us into being alone, without roots, glued to the screen of our computers. The family is the ultimate antidote to all of these ideas. This is the place where you really learn what life is about, and especially if you grow up with many siblings.
Yeah, well, and on the practical side of this, and again, I love, these principles, and you outlined many of them in your book, but they're Catholic principles. These are really the foundations of any free people, because without having children, you really don't have any stakes in the game. You really don't have any skin in the game. And so it's all about you and what you can get out of the government and out of society.
Exactly.
Whereas if you have a family, you're building something for the future. And that, I believe, is really the missing link here in America and in many of these Western democracies. They are suffering from the death of the family, and unless you revive that, it's party over. Another rule is be Catholic and practice your faith. Now, curiously, you quote Henry Kissinger in the book, in his book Diplomacy, where he contrasts your ancestor, Ferdinand II, and the French Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs, Cardinal Richelieu, during the Reformation. Richelieu, although a Catholic cardinal, believed everything, including the church, should be subordinate to the state, and could not understand why Ferdinand was unwilling to make concessions about faith. There's a very telling quote that shows his motivation. I'll put it on the screen. "Non-Catholics think me unfeeling for banning heresy, but I love them rather than I hate them. If I didn't love them, I would freely leave them in their error." You're right that Austria and the Habsburg family are still largely Catholic today because Ferdinand II did not yield to politics. Why is it so important today for Catholics to practice their faith and not yield to politics?
Wow, that's I think one of the central points. I think it was more or less after the time of John F. Kennedy, after his famous speech before his election, where he more or less gave the message, my Catholic faith will not influence my political decisions, that being a Catholic and showing your faith in politics, at least in Europe, went out of fashion. The idea is if I'm neutral, if I'm not a religious person, and if nobody knows what I believe, then more people will vote for me. And I think this is wrong. I think a politician should have a faith, because if I know what your faith is, I know what I can hold you accountable for. And also, if somebody believes in God and believes in a final judgment where he will have to render accountability to God, then he will, in my books, be less tempted to be corrupt and to do terrible things in political positions. So I strongly encourage people, if they're Catholic, to go into politics and to live their faith and to show their faith. We have forgotten about this.
Well, I agree with you. I think the first mark of an inauthentic politician is one who says, you know, I have these deeply held beliefs that I'm going to put aside so I can serve you. This is madness. But that is exactly what so many of these politicians have done in the past and continue to do to this present day, and their major heads of state. I won't have to name them because you know who they are. Blessed Karl, the Emperor of Austria, King of Hungary, really one of your most well-known ancestors. He is going to be, he's on the road to canonization. He was a devout Catholic, devout family man and peacemaker. What impact has his legacy had on not only the Habsburgs, but on you personally?
That's a good question. On the Habsburgs, he's the most popular Habsburg in my entire family, among the young ones. By the way, also in the United States. And if you think about it, this man who was only emperor for 1.5 years, who lost a war, who lost the empire, who went into exile and who died miserably in exile, this man who was, for all reasons of the world, a loser, this man that most people don't even know about, he's the most important, and for us Habsburgs, most impressive of our emperors. And this is because he was truly authentic, a Christian in all what he did. He was a Christian in his vocation as a Christian. He really was heroic in his striving for sanctity. He was a Christian in his love for his wife and his children. He had 8 wonderful children with her. And he was a Christian, as one of my nieces used to say, in his job, which happened to be emperor. His Christian and his Catholic faith really influenced his social politics. And one thing he did, and this is something that I think a lot about, is he offered his life for his people. When he was in exile, he told God, especially when he lay dying, all his suffering he gave for his people, for the people who had just sent him into exile. Now, I wish that we could inspire a few politicians to be that much in love with their country that they would offer up their suffering in disease and even their lives for their people. This is an incredible example by Blessed Karl. So he's our great hero.
Amazing. What's been the importance of the Catholic faith in the Habsburg family historically? And how does that carry on today among your relatives and yourself?
One of the points of my book is definitely that I want to show that there were ups and downs in the Habsburg Catholic faith. While they all were Catholic and baptized Catholics, not all of them were devout Catholics. And you can tell, unfortunately, one of the moments where the emperors weren't absolutely devout Catholics was during the Reformation. So the Habsburg emperors were, so to speak, weak sauce during the decades after the Reformation. But thank God, in that time, other members of the family shone like a light, really, in the Austrian lands. So that was that. And the Habsburgs are still Catholic. I always say one difficult time was the 19th century. The last priestly vocation in the Habsburg family was around 1800. And the next priestly vocation in the Habsburg family then was around the year 2000. It was my brother who became a priest. So for 200 years, we didn't have any priestly vocation in a family with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of young men born. So you must ask yourself, okay, nowadays we're back to 3 priestly vocations and lots of young Habsburgs praying the rosary, going to Mass. So we're going to be around a long time, and we're going to be Catholic.
You dedicate a chapter to subsidiarity in the book. It's entitled, Believe in the Empire and Subsidiarity. And you write that, quote, subsidiarity has been a bedrock principle of Catholic social teaching for millennia. God gave each of us an intellect and a free will in order that we should take proper responsibility for our actions according to our station in life. But in addition to good theology, subsidiarity is simply sensible and politically efficient policy. When an institution is closer to a problem, it's usually best equipped to handle it. Now, you point out that we are living in a time where there's a push to offshore all of responsibility and policy upstairs and away from the people. Why have we lost this principle of subsidiarity, and what's the danger in losing it?
Subsidiarity is the idea that you let the lower level handle what the lower level can handle, and the higher you go up, the less power is there. And this is the America is built on that principle. America is our United States, and the states should be strong. Even stronger should be the township, and of course the family should be the strongest on the lowest level. The Habsburg Empire was built up the same way, with an incredible respect for every single country within that empire, and less power was held on higher levels, the better it was. Now we seem to live in a time where decisions seem to be taken on such a high level and so far removed from democratic legitimation that I believe rediscovering the principle of subsidiarity is the absolute antidote to globalism, is the absolute antidote to the feeling that we sometimes have that things are being decided far away from our local level. And that is not good, because we are human beings. We live for the local level. Democracy is strongest on the local level, and therefore we should try to rediscover this. And that's one of the messages of the book in my chapter on empire and subsidiarity.
Well, you love, when I watched the Papal Visit, you could see the community of the Hungarian people coming together and the various groups that came out to see the Holy Father. And look, I live in New Orleans. I'm here in Nashville now. The community here is so vibrant. That's an important part, certainly, of American life, but it should predominate throughout the West, and it is dying. Even in polls, you see young people, not only are they saying they don't want to have children and get married, but they don't want to live in a community. They don't care about community. That, to me, is the death of a unified people, and certainly a democratic, free, liberty-loving people. That's over. Hungary is considered by many nations, Edward, as especially those that are part of the European Union, to be a rebel country of sorts. And they're accused of being too nationalistic, perhaps believing too much in subsidiarity. How would you respond to that?
I would respond with something that our Prime Minister Viktor Orban said in a speech in Italy after he visited the Pope. He said, we're often accused by Brussels that we don't stand for European values anymore. For instance, when we make a law that protects our minor kids from LGBT indoctrination in Hungary. We don't stand for European values anymore. And he says, if Adenauer, Schuman and de Gasperi, the founders of the European Union, would come back today, where would they find European values? In Brussels or in Central Europe? So what Hungary says is, we stand for these values. You, west of us, seem to have abandoned a few of them, but we can rediscover them.
While writing the book, you researched a great number of your family members. I mean, we've talked about a few of them. Who were you most surprised and inspired by?
Wow. Oh, yes. Well, I would say Archduchess Magdalena. I managed I did on Twitter, I did a championship of the Habsburgs, and people voted for their favorite Habsburgs. I managed to get her into the second round. It wasn't bad for an unknown archduchess of the 16th century. What she did was incredible. She was a daughter of the Emperor Ferdinand I, and he wanted to marry her off, but she wanted to become a nun. And he said, no way, I'm going to marry you off. A famous painting was made of her by Arcimboldo, the famous painter. And then she insisted, with the help of her confessor, who was St. Peter Canisius. And she managed to convince her father that she could found a monastery. And she founded a monastery with two of her sisters, lots of vocations. But her great hour came in the time of Counter-Reformation, when the nuncio from Rome came, and he knew he couldn't go to the emperor because, as I told you before, the emperor was weak sauce. So he went to Hall in Tyrol, to that monastery. He spoke with Magdalena. Magdalena brought him together with two of her brothers in other parts of Austria, and with her sister in Bavaria, who was the Duchess of Bavaria. And together they made a meeting in 1579, and together they made a bullet list how to take back Austria for the Catholic faith. And that list you can still find online. It's fantastic. And that was just because she followed her vocation. She was a wonderful woman. She's the only other venerable we have in the family. We have one blessed and one venerable. So my money is on Magdalena of Austria.
Okay, we will leave it there. Loved the book, The Habsburg Way, 7 Rules for Turbulent Times, by Archduke of Austria, Eduard Habsburg, and Hungary's ambassador to the Holy See. It's available now at bookstores everywhere and online. Eduard Habsburg, thank you for being here.
Thank you, Raymond. It was a joy talking to you.